Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Abdulrahman Ali, and my colleague Essa Al-Khaldi. Today, inshallah, we are going to talk about the displacement profiles of a crank motion and forces. Of course, for any experiments, we do need the equipment. So our first equipment is called the balance, okay, the spring balance, and the second equipment, which is a crank wheel, and we have the crank arm, and we have the sliding rod, and also we do have the linear scale and the pulley, and we do have also the hanger and the weight, which is a hanger weight.
Okay guys, my name is Essa Al-Khaldi, and now I will explain to you the mechanism of the displacement profile of crank motion and forces. So this experiment uses the crank and slider mechanism. The crank and slider mechanism represents a fundamental building block in a wide array of machinery, including internal combustion engines, reciprocating pumps, and robotic arms, and the displacement profiles here. This simple mechanism translates the rotational motion into linear motion, enabling a wide range of functionalities. So how it converts the rotational motion into linear motion. See, if I pull this rope down, I'm applying force to the spring balance, and that the spring balance is connected with the rope to the crank wheel, which rotates, and the crank wheel is connected to the crank arm, which converts the rotational motion into a linear motion. And also it is connected to the pulley. The pulley is also connected to the hanger.
Hello guys, we continue our experiment with the procedure. So first we opened the TQ ES12 crank and toggle kit as shown here. Then we set up the work panel by collecting the work panel. We collected, as you can see here. Okay. We started the experiment by connecting the slider first assembly. This is, we call it a slider assembly, and the crank arm assembly, and the crank wheel connected through the panel with thin rope, as you can see. And screws, you can see the screws here, and we have here also, and we do have here and at the back, you can see from there. Okay, we adjusted the linear scale of a slider assembly and the angle of a crank wheel to 0. So we have to make this one 0. Okay, we have to 0 the angle, and also we have to 0 the angle by bringing this pointer to 0. After that, we rotated the crank wheel clockwise, okay, each time by 10, okay, by 10 degrees, until I reached 360. And we noted that in table 1.
Guys, after we rotated the crank wheel clockwise each time by 10 degrees, as my colleague just said that, and we noted that in the table, and while we were rotating the crank wheel, the linear scale was also increasing until it reached its maximum. We disassembled the entire setup, and we returned the parts back to their places. And then for the forces, for crank forces experiment, we did the same steps. We joined all these parts together, and then we added the spring balance, because before we were only rotating these two parts without a spring balance, but now we added the spring balance. We also added the weight hanger with the pulley. We adjusted the spring balance scale to 0, as you can see, and then we increased the weight here. We increase the weight each time by 10 grams. So each of them, each weight is 10 grams until we reached 500 grams, or we can say 0.5 kilogram. We slid the spring balance upward and downward, and we rotated the crank each time by 10 degrees. And we noted the information and the data in the table.
Hello guys, now we are going to talk about the experimental data. Okay, we noticed that we rotate the crank wheel each time by 10 degrees, starting from 0 to 360 degrees, and the linear scale, which represents the displacement in millimeter, was changing. Okay, those are all the angles and displacements that we got them and noted them down. The displacement of the crank is greatest at 90 degrees and 200 degrees, and 0 at 0 degrees, 180 degrees, and 360 degrees. The displacement is symmetric about the 90 degree and 270 degree points. The displacement is negative between 0 degree and 90 degrees, and between 270 degrees and 360 degrees. The displacement positive between 90 degrees and 180 degrees, and between 180 degrees and 270 degrees.
So guys, in the table, in table 2, which represents angle versus displacement, the force on the crank, we had force, we had torque, we had measured torque, and we had theoretical torque. I will tell you later how we found the theoretical torque, but now I will tell you how the description about the data. Then I will tell you how I calculated the measured torque and the theoretical torque as well. So the force on the crank was greatest at 90 degrees and 270 degrees, and was 0 at 0 degrees, and was 0 also at 180 degrees. The force is symmetric about the 90 degrees and 270 degrees points. The measured torque was greatest at 90 degrees and 270 degrees as well. The theoretical torque was also greatest at 90 and 270 degrees as well. As you can see, I measured the theoretical torque by multiplying the R, which was the radius for the crank wheel, which was 20 millimeter, and I multiplied it by the force, which we call it here E. So the force, we got it from the experiment, so that's how we got the theoretical torque. Sorry, I mean for the practical torque. And for the theoretical torque, first I had to find alpha, which is the angle, equal the sine inverse of R. R is the radius here of the crank R. Then I took the sine of the theta. Theta was the rotational angle, which was from 10 to 180 degrees we used in the experiment. And then I divided this by the L. L was the length, which was 60 millimeter. The length from here until here, it was 60 millimeter. First I found alpha, then I put this equation, T, which is the torque, equal P, which is the force, multiplied by tan alpha multiplied by r, which is the small radius, which was 15 millimeter, cosine theta, which was the degree obtained from the experiment, and then plus L, which was the length that I just showed you. Then cosine alpha, the alpha was the one that I just explained to you how I got it. Guys, you can see here the data I obtained from the experiment, and this is the analysis. This is the graph that represents the crank angle versus linear displacement, and this also crank angle, but this time versus turning force. Practically, the turning force is the torque or practical torque. So guys, also we had the crank angle versus the turning force theoretically this time, and this is the graph that represents crank angle versus both practical and theoretical torque. To finalize and sum up, the experiment was effectively examined the connection between crank angle, displacement, and the force in a crank and slider mechanism using the concept of displacement profiles of crank motion and forces. The findings demonstrate that displacement, force, and torque all exhibit variations in relation to crank angle. The force and measured torque both align with the crank angle's face, whereas the theoretical torque differs by 90 degrees. The experiment was successful in achieving its objectives of investigating the relationship between the crank angle, displacement, and force in a crank and slider mechanism. The data obtained from the experiment can be used to validate theoretical models and to design more efficient crank and slider mechanism. Thank you. That's it for the video. I would like to thank my colleague Abdulrahman, and thank you all for watching this video. Thank you very much.